Did I just hear like a Siri? All right, well, good morning, everybody. I think we're going to go ahead and get started here. I hate to break up good fellowship, as we all often say when good fellowship is occurring as we're getting ready to start, but we got a roll to do here, so let's get going. Good morning, everybody. We got a roll to do here, so let's get going. Good morning, everybody. Glad to get to be here with you. It's been a couple months. In case you don't recall this face, because I believe it was covered by hair at that point. That was when I was still allowed to have a beard according to the rules there at Bear Valley. They changed that even for us seniors. Oh well. So my name is Trevor. I am going to be with you guys here in a couple months. I have been chomping at the bit. That senioritis is really setting in at this point. I got to be honest. This is my third time being a senior at that. So I'm looking forward to get to joining your ranks here and helping the work here. Please continue praying for me as I continually pray for you. That way we can get some real good work done here. So today, go ahead and turn your Bibles to Luke chapter 7. That's where we're going to be. I understand you guys have been going through a series of lessons. Going to give you a little break from that this week. Be in Luke. Now, in order to discuss Luke, where did I put my water bottle? In order to discuss Luke, I want to kind of get a little bit of background on it because we're going to jump into Luke chapter 7. That's where we're going to be at pretty much all morning. Go ahead and turn there. While you're turning there, let's talk a little bit about who the man is himself. Who is Luke? Question from me to you. Who is Luke? He's a physician. In fact, if you turn to Colossians chapter 4, verse 14, you can see that Paul calls him a physician there. That's where we know that. Who else is Luke?
Not a Jew.
Say again?
Not a Jew.
Not a Jew. Man, he's getting right to the core of it. The only Bible writer who wasn't a Jew. Which means he was a what? A Gentile, exactly. So, being a Gentile and being the only Bible writer, he actually brings some pretty interesting perspectives, things that we're going to delve into just a bit here in a moment, and then we'll see that sprinkled in throughout the text. And we should expect to find that. Who was Luke writing to? You can see that he was a Gentile, by the way, in that same passage in Colossians chapter 4. Who was he writing to? Theophilus, that's right. So Theophilus was the recipient of both Luke and Acts. In fact, some folks would even say that those are really two volumes of the same book. Theophilus, who was very likely a fellow Gentile. Now, why was he writing? We're getting into some nitty-gritties at this point. Why did he bother writing to Theophilus? Anybody know off the top of their head? You can find the answer to that in Luke chapter 1, verses 1 through 4. And someone with a big, loud voice, go ahead and read that for us. Luke chapter 1, verses 1 through 4.
That you may know the certainty of those things in which you were instructed.
That indeed is why Luke is writing. Now, when he says you may know with certainty those things you have been taught, I mentioned a minute ago that Luke is a physician. Significantly, we also know that he is a Gentile. Didn't mention until now that he is a historian. Notice there in, I think it's verse 3, it seemed fitting for me as well, having investigated everything carefully. He's a historian. He is going through and digging regarding this history about Jesus, is of course what we'll see Luke is talking to Theophilus about. But importantly, for me, because I've got a bias, he also appears to be an apologist, a very early apologist, defending who Jesus is to this Theophilus and thereby anybody else because it's the inspired text. Now, why did we spend a few minutes talking about all the background regarding who he's writing to, who he is, all of his perspectives? Why is it important to know that kind of background regarding really any Bible writer? So we have the context. We need the historical context in order to get a better perspective, a more complete perspective on why what we're studying in the books that these men have written for our benefit, that really the benefit of the world. All right. So before we jump into Luke 7, if you joined us a little late, that's where we're going to be today. Luke chapter 7, go ahead and turn there. We're just going to real quickly race through kind of a synopsis of where we have been or where Luke has been up to this point. Important to this, Luke is also, it seems to be, the only gospel writer who is consistently concerned with writing consecutively the order of events that occurs in that text. Matthew, he writes a lot more topically. There are going to be events that happened at the beginning of the book of Matthew that seem to happen towards the end of Jesus' life, and that's because Matthew has a different purpose. He was writing to Jews who saw things differently. Theophilus, not a Jew, who Luke was writing to. All right, so in chapter 1, all the way up through chapter 3 of Luke, we've got Jesus' life beginning and really seeing how Luke emphasizes the Holy Spirit and rejoicing regarding Jesus coming. You can find a whole bunch of speech sections in there from all these different people who are very excited that Jesus is coming. In fact, one man, Zacharias, I think, or no, it's Simeon. Simeon, a priest who literally got to live just long enough to see Jesus come, and then he died not long after that. Chapters 4 through 5, about verse 26, we start to see Luke establish Christ and who he is. He defends himself against Satan in the wilderness, steels himself against temptation. And then he goes off and starts doing some miracles and doing some teachings and so forth. We're getting Jesus' qualifications in, if you will, about who he is. That establishes his credibility, but it also establishes his ministry. And just after that, starting in verse 27 of chapter 5, working all the way up through 6:19, we see the calling of various disciples. And then finally, before we get into chapter 7, we have 6:20 through 6:49, and you would have all this up there. My PowerPoint wasn't ready for you. I apologize for that. But the Sermon on the Mount, and that's where Luke really gets into a lot of these different themes as Jesus is describing them. And what's really important about that is this. Luke, being a Gentile, how did the Jews care about the Gentiles? What was their perspective of them? They didn't like them a whole lot. In fact, I think you're being very gentle. I think you're being deliberately gentle. Saying they pretty much hated them. That's right. They downright hated the Gentiles. Was that God's plan? It was not God's plan. Now, they didn't just hate the Gentiles or look down upon those folks. They also looked down on women at this point. They looked down on the destitute at this point. Pretty much, if you weren't of the religious elite, like the Pharisees or Sadducees, who also didn't like each other, by the way, pretty much didn't care about you. Luke, being a Christian that Christ loved, he's probably got some pretty interesting perspectives, and that is where we're going to look at in chapter 7. I kind of view chapter 7 as, instead of Luke so much establishing Christ's credibility anymore, at this point we've seen Jesus exhibit authority over various diseases, I think over the storms, and we're certainly going to see that later on in chapter 8. But here, Jesus, instead of being this powerful God, which Luke at this point has already done and shown us, he also shows us why we would want to follow him. Not just to keep this very powerful deity happy, but rather to give us hope. I like to call this section the love of the lost section. So, if you're in chapter 7, there are a few different stories that are going on there, and it starts with a couple of different miracles, starting with a familiar account, the Centurion. This account is in Matthew chapter 8 as well, but Luke offers us some pretty interesting insights there. Let's go ahead and read the first, I think, 10 verses. Another person with a loud, proud voice. Verses 7 through 10. Excuse me, chapter 7, verses 1 through 10. Not all at once. I'll do it now if we got to. When he had completed all his discourse in the hearing of the people, he went to Capernaum. And a centurion's slave, who was highly regarded by him, was sick and about to die. When he heard about Jesus, he sent some Jewish elders asking him to come and save the life of his slave. When they came to Jesus, they earnestly implored him, saying, "He is worthy for you to grant this to him, for he loves our nation, and it was he who built us our synagogue." Now Jesus started on his way with them, and when he was not far from the house, the centurion sent friends, saying to him, "Lord, do not trouble yourself further, for I am not worthy for you to come under my roof. For this reason I did not even consider myself worthy to come to you. But just say the word, and my servant will be healed. For I am also a man placed under authority, with soldiers under me. And I say to this one, go, and he goes, and to another one, come, and he comes, and to my slave, do this, and he does it." Now when Jesus heard this, he marveled at him, and turned and said to the crowd that was following him, "I say to you, not even in Israel have I found such great faith." And when those who had been sent returned to the house, they found the slave in good health. Really awesome story that surely Luke was going to point out, because the centurion was a fellow Gentile. Probably fun for him to talk about. But this is an important passage for a number of reasons. First of all, just by way of kind of setting up the scene, in verse 1, when he had completed all his discourse, that's actually, Luke, it seems, is pulling a little bit of inspiration from Matthew in some respects. I'm not actually literally pulling. But anytime that Jesus was done with a major speech section in the book of Matthew, there are 5 of those in case you're interested, it's just letting him know that we're moving, or letting us know that we're moving along to the next thing going on in Capernaum. Now, this first miracle, the healing of the centurion's servant, what seems to be the central, who is the central character really in this passage of the text? At least, who does it seem to focus on?
The centurion.
The centurion. What about the centurion?
His faith.
His faith. We're looking at this faith of the centurion. In fact, you recall that Jesus marveled at that faith. And I do think marveled. And we often talk about Jesus as God, and good, we should, because he is God. But we also need to talk a lot about the fact that he's a man. I think Jesus was genuinely blown away by this. That's what the text says anyway. But do you notice what he did once he marveled? What did he do right after he marveled? And there in verse 9.
Turned around and said to the crowd,
Said to the crowd. Who was probably in that crowd that was following him? Jews. Yeah, do you think that rang their bell a little bit? See, Jesus at that point is showing us, and of course Luke as he writes this, is showing us that faithfulness is not exclusive to Jews. And you can see this peppered throughout the Old Testament. A lot of very interesting parallels in actually the books of 1st and 2nd Kings and Luke. If you really look through there, I encourage you to check that out sometime. But this isn't just for Jews. Jesus didn't just come for the Jews. He came for the Gentiles. And they could have this remarkable faith. Now notice a couple of other things here. Why did Jesus marvel? What was the cause of it? We know it's the centurion's faith, but how did he demonstrate the faith? What did he say to Jesus through his ambassadors?
He wasn't even worthy to have him come to his house and just speak, and he would be healed.
How did he describe Jesus? A man with authority. See, authority recognizes authority here. This centurion, I would really love to meet this guy. I'd want him to be Cornelius from Acts chapter 10. I don't actually think he is, but I want him to be. I think it'd be cool. But this centurion, recognizing this authority, note that he says, I am a man under authority. So not only does he acknowledge that, hey, I could tell someone to go and do this and they do it, so implying that Jesus is capable of doing that very same thing, which he goes and does, but he says under authority. What I think is very important about that, if you come back up to verse 6, he says, Lord, do not trouble yourself further. See, I don't think that the centurion was just submitting to his authority, that is, or yes, his worldly authority, being under Rome. That word Lord there is a term of submission. I submit to your authority. I think that's pretty important. Now, we spent a lot of time talking about the centurion. The gospel's not about the centurion. What happens at this point? What does Jesus do in response to that faith?
Heals the servant.
He heals the servant. This is some pretty cool stuff happening here. The centurion says, you have authority. And, I'm paraphrasing there a little bit. But Jesus then demonstrates that authority. And I personally find 3 different things that he's got authority over. He healed the guy. What has he got authority over? Disease. He's got authority over disease. Authority, not just power to control it or the ability to heal as we heal, but has authority over it. That implies that the disease obeys him. In fact, later on in Luke, I think later on in chapter 8, or it might be back in chapter 5, I'm a little rusty on that bit, there's a point where he rebukes disease. But you might also recall that he rebukes the storm and the sea, and they obey him. Now, of course, the storm and the sea aren't in here. We've got disease being obeyed. Did Jesus have to go right to the guy? No. Not only, I think this is cool, and maybe this is just the science fiction lover in me coming out here, but not only did Jesus not have to go to the guy, he was healed immediately, which we can actually find back in Matthew, in the Matthew account. Jesus doesn't have just power over disease, he's got power over time and space. I mean, that's cool, right? Why is that important to the writing of Luke? Who is Luke writing to? He's writing to Theophilus, who was a Gentile. Who are we? Gentiles. He is defending Christ, establishing his authority. I mean, there is just a constant theme of this. I mean, when you start reading through Luke, appreciating the fact that he is writing to defend Christ and who he is, you're going to see all of this really peppered throughout. Anybody got any? We're going to move on to the next miracle here in a moment, but if you've got a thought or two, feel free to speak up now.
The other interesting thing is that Luke, as a physician,
Great point.
is writing about this. When we think of healing, we think, well, whoever's doing the medical care has to be there. You have to have an intervention for the patient to have the healing. And certainly Luke, as a physician, would have the same thought process, but this clearly, Jesus didn't have to be in the physical presence of the servant to heal him.
Right. And I'm really glad you drew that out. I mean, this is going to validate who Jesus is even more to Theophilus because of Luke's unique perspective, specifically as a physician, not just a fellow Gentile. Any other thoughts, responses to that? All right, let's jump into verse 11. We're going to read through verse 16 here. Soon afterwards, he went to a city called Nain, and his disciples were going along with him, accompanied by a large crowd. Now as he approached the gate of the city, a dead man was being carried out, the only son of his mother, and she was a widow, and a sizable crowd from the city was with her. When the Lord saw her, he felt compassion for her and said to her, "Do not weep." And he came up and touched the coffin, and the bearers came to a halt. And he said, "Young man, I say to you, arise." And the dead man sat up and began to speak, and Jesus gave him back to his mother. Fear gripped them all, and they began glorifying God, saying, "A great prophet has arisen among us, and God has visited his people." There are lots of things we could draw out of this, but I want to focus on 2 big things. First of all, We've got this woman, this widow, whose only son is dead. I mean, Jesus has compassion. Jesus shows compassion a whole lot. So I guess that's not really a huge surprise to us. Of course, we also have the whole Bible to work from. Theophilus didn't. Why does it matter so much that she was a widow with an only son who died?
That's the only way of making a living.
The only way that she was going to be able to take care of herself, really, in that culture, was by having a man in the family. Her only son is dead, and she's a widow. Her husband's dead. She's destitute at this point. Remember earlier on, I mentioned that Luke, being a Gentile, how the Jews look down on groups of folks like this. She's destitute, and she's a woman. And Jesus has compassion on who? Her. The Messiah had compassion on her. Now, of course, Theophilus, being a Gentile, knew him as the Christ, but the point is, there's compassion being shown to this woman. Now, we see that first. Jesus brings the son back to life. What's important about that part? Not just supporting that woman. What is so important about him bringing the guy back to life?
Not only was he dead, but he was also prepared for burial, so
He'd been dead a while. Fun fact, church. If you recall back in Luke chapter 1, verses 1 through 4, where Luke tells us why he's writing, to whom he's writing, when he says that he's writing in an order of events, this is the first recorded account where Jesus raises somebody from the dead. So at this point, in just, 16 verses, in 16 verses, we see Jesus demonstrate authority over disease, over time, over space, and very crucially, over death. This guy is worth following, not just because he is powerful, though, but because he's got a heart for these people. He marvels at the faith of Gentiles and has compassion on destitute widows. That totally flips the script on what a lot of the religious folks would have thought of, even at the time of Luke's writing. And then finally, in verse 16, fear gripped them all. That's an interesting response, isn't it? You know, the word there in the Greek, and I know people love to give Greek lessons. We won't spend much time with that. But the word is phobos. That sound familiar? But what word does that sound like in our English language today? Phobos. Sounds a lot like phobia. What is a phobia? An intense fear. Pretty strong fear. That's an interesting response to the power of someone who says, well, what do they say there in that last little quote there in verse 16? God has visited his people. I think there might be a little bit of a just a personal lesson in there, I think, about the kind of appreciation for God we should have in some respects. All right. So it's at this point, as we work our way a lot through the text here, a lot of what's about to pop up you can find back, I think, in Matthew chapter 11, once we get into these references to John the Baptist. Because of that, we won't spend a terrible lot of time in here, but I do think there are some important points in the text we should draw out. Starting with this, in verse 17, this report concerning him, the Greek word there is really more like this word concerning him, but so news, went all out over Judea and in all the surrounding district. The disciples of John reported to him about these things. Summoning 2 of his disciples, John sent them to the Lord, saying, "Are you the expected one, or do we look for someone else?" So just in those quick 3 verses there, I suppose I should also read verse 20, sorry. When the men came to him, they said, John the Baptist has sent us to you to ask, are you the expected one, or do we look for someone else? Just a couple of interesting points in there. Notice that Luke, who investigated all of these things, seems like he's probably investigated these reports, this word, this news surrounding Jesus. I mean, he investigated these things, right? That's what it said back in chapter 1, verses 1 through 4, I think verse 4. So I think that just helps further qualify Luke and the studies that he's done. And also, I think it's kind of funny that, and we have back-to-back verses, John says, hey, go and do this thing, and then the guys go and do the thing and say that they did the thing. I think that's fun. Now, in the account in Matthew chapter 11, I think it's Matthew 11, I might be misremembering that. When they come up, prompted by John the Baptist to approach Jesus, are you this guy? Jesus, jump down in verse 22 of Luke chapter 7, and he answered and said to them, go and report to John what you have seen and heard. The blind receive sight, the lame walk, the lepers are cleansed, the deaf hear, the dead are raised up, and the poor have the gospel preached to them. That's all that Matthew refers to. But there's a verse between the guys approaching Jesus and what Jesus tells them to go and say to John. What happens in verse 21? Go and read it out, somebody.
In that hour, he healed many people of diseases and plagues, and evil spirits on many who were blind and stone sight.
So, what's going on here? Jesus is showing all of these things, demonstrating this more and more, not just to the people who have been there with him, but to the disciples of John. Essentially, how is Jesus responding to their question about him? To John's question, really.
Prophecies are being fulfilled for sure.
Prophecies are being fulfilled.
And I think John already knows that. This is where everybody has an opinion on this. I think John is really saying, when are you getting me out of prison? That's what he's really saying. You're the Messiah when you get me out of prison. Because John's known since he was in the womb that this is the Christ. I don't think he has a doubt. I don't see a doubt. Some people do. I don't. But I think obviously Jesus shows miracles that have been predicted. He said, yeah, you can rest assured I'm here. Because nobody else can do what I can do.
Well, definitely at this point, Jesus has been baptized at this point by John the Baptist. So there's definitely some level of knowing that he is. But maybe because he's in prison, that's an interesting thought. Because he's in prison, maybe he needs a little encouragement in that respect. But by doing these things, Jesus says, yes, I am the person that you've been waiting for. As we work our way down through verses 24 all the way down into about verse 30, pretty much get a whole lot of verbatim stuff that happens back in Matthew. We're not really going to focus on that. But do notice here in verses 29 and 30, you're going to get sick of me saying all of this, I promise, but Luke says it a whole lot. I think it's important. Notice, when all the people and the tax collectors heard this, remember, tax collectors, not very appreciated in that community at that time, they acknowledged God's justice, having been baptized with the baptism of John. But who rejected God's purpose? In verse 30. The Pharisees and the lawyers. Now, the lawyers are not in the sense of we think of today, not really attorneys. They're knowers of the law, kind of givers of the law. That they just know it very well, so to speak. Those are the ones who reject it. Again, you see this constant theme that the gospel is for everyone. We've talked about the centurion, his slave, the widow woman. I think you can make an argument for John the Baptist as well. Then more of the people, and even tax collectors at this point. We've also seen Jesus establish his power over pretty much all facets of existence. Disease, he's got authority over. We've seen time and space. I'm going to keep saying that because I think it's cool. Over death, crucially important. And just later on, when he was defending himself, who he was defending, I don't mean like argumentative, but saying, yes, I am who you think I am. He shows power over demons as well. So he's got power over the physical world or realm and over the spiritual. This powerful person, he cares about everyone. And the people who don't seem to care about him are the ones who should recognize who he is at this point. The next couple verses in the chapter deal a lot with, again, more of that stuff you can see back in Matthew. Not really going to look at that unless anybody's got a quick thought about some of those things. We're going to get into my favorite, really, personally, and I know you're not here for my favorite stuff, but something I really like is what's coming up in verse 36. Any other thoughts? Sorry, my ear totally popped there. That's why I'm opening my mouth. Okay. Verses 36 through 50 of Luke chapter 7, I think is one of the most beautiful passages in the Bible regarding the compassion of Christ. It's also very interesting, everything that's going on. We'll start here in verse 36. Now one of the Pharisees was requesting him to dine with him, and he entered the Pharisee's house and reclined at the table. And there was a woman in the city who was a sinner. And when she learned that he was reclining at the table in the Pharisee's house, she brought an alabaster vial of perfume, and standing behind him at his feet, weeping, she began to wet his hair with her tears, and kept wiping them with the hair of her head, and kissing his feet, and anointing them with the perfume. Now when the Pharisee who had invited him in saw this, he said to himself, if this man were a prophet, he would know who and what sort of person this woman is who is touching him, and that she is a sinner. All right, we'll stop there. You totally isolate this text, and it's kind of, I think, kind of weird. You get this, he's in a Pharisee's house, first of all, so that's a little odd. Being invited. There are actually several dinners where Pharisees invite Jesus, and for the most part, they're there to kind of put him on the spot. Not totally out of the blue, but still kind of strange relative to the whole life of Jesus. And then you get this woman who just shows up, who hears that he's there, shows up to the house, and starts wiping his feet with her hair and crying enough to wet them, it seems. I mean, I think that's very strange. Of course, that's if you isolate the text. We're not supposed to do that. We'll see later on why she is weeping so much. But what really strikes me here, back in verse 36, now one of the Pharisees was, what's that word? Requesting him. Now, a lot of it mentioned a couple times now that the Greek communicates things that the English doesn't quite communicate for us sometimes. But here, it seems like the English translation is quite good, as is the case in the vast majority of other passages, 99% of the Bible, in case you cared. Requesting him implies a genuine interest in something that you don't often see from the Pharisees. I think we'll see more of that here later on. I really think what's going on here is this fellow who we're about to see, his name's Simon. I think he's genuinely interested in what's going on here. And I don't think he's like, if he knew who this woman was, I think he's thinking to himself, if he knew who that was, so like, what's going on? I think he's being very inquisitive here, and I'll defend that position as we move forward. And Jesus answered him, Simon, I have something to say to you. And how did he reply? Teacher, say it. Teacher. Remember back when the centurion said, Lord? I think there's a connection there. It says, say it, teacher. A moneylender had 2 debtors. This is Jesus speaking. A moneylender had 2 debtors, one who owed 500 denarii and the other 50. When they were unable to repay, he graciously forgave them both. So which one of them will love him more? Simon answered and said, I suppose the one whom he forgave more. And he said to him, you have judged correctly. Something that we should, well, you know what, I'll hold on to that for a sec, just a little longer. I do think that Jesus, when he says, Simon, I have something to say to you, I think it was kind of in response to that thought. Again, he said to himself, you remember that time where Jesus healed the paralytic and the Pharisees were like, who is this man who blasphemes and forgives sins, blah, blah, blah. He turns and rebukes them, right? I don't think that's what's happening here. Even, well, at least not rebuking them angrily, rebuking him in a sense that he needs taught. Look there in verse 44. Turning toward the woman, he said to Simon, and I'm putting a lot of my own conjecture into this, so the way that I'm moving this tone, just so it's clear, this is Trevor 3:2. It is not Luke 7:44. What I think's happening here, he turned toward the woman and said to Simon, do you see this woman? I entered your house. You gave me no water for my feet, but she's wet my feet with her tears, wiped them with her hair. You gave me no kiss, but she, since the time I came in, has not ceased to kiss my feet. You did not anoint my head with oil, but she anointed my feet with perfume. For this reason I say to you, her sins, which are many, have been forgiven. For she loved much, but he who is forgiven little loves little. This story that started in verse 36 and runs all the way to verse 50 is one of about 10 different instances in the Bible. I keep moving that water bottle. It's one of about 10 instances in the Gospels, that is recorded in all 4 accounts. If you look at all 4 accounts, while they shouldn't necessarily, what's that bell mean? Awesome. Because we're about to get to the climax, and that would have been awful. While we shouldn't use other Gospels to necessarily inform the context of what each Gospel writer is saying, right, because each one of them has their own purpose, it does give us some insight on what all is going on. I think it's the Matthew account. It might be John. Yeah, I think it's John. In chapter 12, we find out that Jesus is at the home of Simon the leper, where a woman is anointing his feet. You can see in Matthew some of the same kind of language going on, and Mark briefly touches on it. Simon the leper, it seems quite clear to me, is Simon the Pharisee. That's a huge reason why I don't think Jesus is rebuking this guy. I think he is genuinely like, what's going on? Now, what's the deal with lepers? How were lepers supposed to live their lives? Outside. Is this Pharisee, who surely knows the law, do we see him covering his face and saying, unclean, unclean, and get out of the way? That's not what's going on. I don't know this. The Bible doesn't say. But earlier on, when Jesus has gone through and he's healed all these different people of various illnesses and ailments, seems as though, I think, that Simon might have been among them. This Pharisee who became a leper and then was healed, and he was like, you got to come home with me. I got to talk with you. I don't know that these are some speculations of mine, but you look at the text, that really seems to be what I think is going on. So it's at this point, the lepers, the destitute, women, Gentiles, you name it. All of these different people that Jesus cares about, that the religious elite didn't care about. That is something we need to draw out of this text. We need to want to follow Jesus. We know that we should because of his power, but there's also a reason to want to. And this, I think, is what we can really draw out of here. We've talked a lot about what's going on with those folks back in those days. And it drew them to love Jesus. And I do think that Simon did love Jesus. He just had less to forgive, so to speak. He couldn't quite comprehend what was going on. But that woman, she knew what was going on. In fact, if you read in the other accounts, I believe this is Mary, one of the Marys. I want you to consider, maybe you didn't grow up in the church. Maybe you've not been a member of the church your whole life. I think that perspective that you had when you became a Christian, I think that's what Mary was feeling. And for those of us who grew up in the church, I think sometimes we can take these kinds of things for granted. I'm not trying to put words in your mouth. I know that I have done that myself. But now that you're in the church, and now that you're part of that, don't forget about all the other lepers and destitutes, all those other Gentiles out there. If Jesus has the power to forgive the sins of those people and clearly cares about those people, that's a message worth preaching, brothers and sisters. That is something we need to turn to the outside world. We've only got about a minute. Does anybody have any closing thoughts on that before we wrap it up for service? All righty, then I guess I'll give you about a minute today. You are dismissed.